evening. I am Susan Byer, the Executive Director of the Allen County Public Library, and welcome on this beautiful, warm spring May evening. I appreciate you. That's a joke, by the way. I appreciate you coming out tonight. We're honored to have you here at the main library, the home of the Rolland Center for Lincoln Research, where we have priceless artifacts and technology coming together to produce this beautiful, immersive experience about Lincoln life and times. And if you have not been to our Rolland Center yet, I highly encourage a visit. It's open 7 days a week, absolutely for free, on the first floor of our main library. And in its first year of operation, 2022, we boasted over 20,000 visitors there, which we are very, very proud of. I'm going to turn it over to the board chair for the Friends of the Lincoln Collection, Todd Stevenson. Thank you, Todd.
Thank you, Susan, and thanks as always to the Allen County Public Library and its staff. They are so instrumental to what we do and how we do it vis-a-vis being able to present lectures of this nature. Again, my name is Todd Stevenson, and it's my honor to serve as the president of the Friends of the Lincoln Collection of Indiana. I'll speak a little bit more about our organization, but first I want to recognize and thank some people, importantly, Susan and all the staff here who make this happen in so many ways. We've been a part and partners with the Allen County Public Library for about 14 years now in terms of not just the Rolland Center that recently opened, but the work that's been done over those period of years to really bring to life and present and make available the vast collection that we are so proud of that's part of the Lincoln Financial Collection for Lincoln. Also, importantly, she's towards the back of the room. If she would stand, want to recognize and thank Sarah Gabbert. Sarah, I think many people here know of and have a great deal of respect for. Sarah has recently retired as the editor of our key publication, the Lincoln Lore, and has also functioned as our executive director for many years. Also want to thank David Lefke and his family foundation for their support of the Rolland Lecture and other ways that they support our organization over the years. And finally, we couldn't do this together without the support and help of all of our board members of the Friends of the Lincoln Collection of Indiana. So board members that are here, if you would maybe stand and recognize and thank you for your service and efforts. As Susan indicated, we are so proud of our Rolland Center for Lincoln Research. And again, if you have time after the presentation before the doors close at 9 o'clock, you're certainly welcome to peruse the exhibit there. A little bit of history. Many of you may be familiar with our mission and how we came about. In 2009, after the old Lincoln Museum that was resident over at what is now Citizen Square closed, under Ian Rolland's leadership, he put together a group in conjunction with the governor at that time and others to secure the collection that the Lincoln Foundation had gathered and accumulated over really a century almost in terms of Lincoln memorabilia, artifacts, documents, photographs, and so forth. Susan mentioned the Rolland Center for Lincoln Research. That is representative of over 20,000, I believe, Lincoln documents and photographs and so forth that have been digitized. That allows us to put together and present an interactive display. In addition, that will lead to increased use of what we call facility to allow for education outreach. We bring so many groups in from elementary and middle schools to really see and get immersed with the Lincoln story. Mentioned also that Sarah had been our editor of Lincoln Lore. That's a publication that was started in 1929, so we're approaching the 100th anniversary of Lincoln Lore, and there are some recent issues out in the lobby there. If you're not a member of the Friends that would receive this in the mail, please feel free to take one of our copies of recent Lincoln Lore. And with that same message, I would encourage any of you who may not be and are not members of the Friends to consider membership. It's relatively inexpensive to support, and it's so necessary to support the efforts. The other part of what we do extends beyond Fort Wayne. It includes outreach as part of our collection of what we call three-dimensional objects at the Indiana State Museum. And I was just down there last week for the opening of a very neat exhibit that is entitled Influencing Lincoln, the Pursuit of Black Freedom. It will run through October, so if you happen to be in Indianapolis, or it's even worthy of making a visit down there, please feel free, and please take a look at that exhibit, because it includes a lot of the items that are in the larger Lincoln collection, some of which are in our collection here. So please do that. And then at this point, it's my pleasure to introduce the person who will introduce our lecturer tonight, and Mike Horton, one of our board members, will do those honors. So take it away, Mike.
Thank you, Todd. Our guest author tonight is James Oakes, who is here to discuss his book, The Crooked Path to Abolition, Abraham Lincoln and the Antislavery Constitution, which was published in 2021. I think I was asked to introduce Mr. Oakes because of my close personal ties to Abraham Lincoln. In 1965, I worked at Glacier National Park in Montana, northwestern Montana, and my construction supervisor was Avery Ferguson. He grew up in southeastern Montana near the Custer battlefield and knew Curley, who was a scout for Custer. Curley barely escaped being killed at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Custer was with Grant at Appomattox, and Grant knew Lincoln. Maybe that's not a great close personal relationship, but it's the closest I came, and you all now are almost as close as I am to Lincoln. Mr. Oakes is a historian and a professor who teaches at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. He has a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. He's previously taught at Northwestern and Princeton. The Lincoln Forum awards its annual Lincoln Prize for Distinguished Scholarship on the life and career of Abraham Lincoln. Mr. Oakes has won 2 of these, including one for this book that he will speak on tonight. Various aspects of the Constitution have caused dismay, disgust, and even worse in recent times. The 3/5 clause of the Constitution, which gave slave states disproportionate strength in the House of Representatives and the Electoral College, and the Fugitive Slave Clause, which facilitated the rendition of runaway slaves in the North to their owners, are the most notable ones. Mr. Oakes' position is that, notwithstanding such provisions, the Constitution was an anti-slavery document, not a slavery document. The slavery provisions are in the Constitution because the Constitution probably would not have been ratified in their absence. If that had happened, we could well have had 2 different countries at our beginning and many more later, with competing values and interests due to expansion westward and in other directions. Had that occurred, among other results, we might not have been the powerful united country that we became, that was essential to the resistance to and the defeat of the totalitarian states that arose in the 20th century. Although the Constitution has provisions that many consider objectionable, we should remember Hamilton's statement in Federalist 68, about a particular portion of the Constitution, but which applied to the whole. Although it is not perfect, it is at least excellent. Please welcome James Oakes.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Todd, and thanks to the Allen County Library for inviting me. I've known about the extraordinary Lincoln documents here for a very long time because my friend Jerry Prokopovich, who used to run the library, the collection, used to talk all the time about it. So I'm delighted to finally be here. My talk tonight is called Duelling Constitutions, and it is, as Mike said, give you some indication of my most recent book on the subject. In the summer of 1854, the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society sent out word of a large gathering to be held at Harmony Grove in Framingham, 16 miles from Boston, on the 4th of July. For 50 cents, picnickers were offered special trains to and from the grounds. Handbills blared the theme of the meeting, "No Slavery," and promised addresses by eminent speakers, among them Sojourner Truth and Henry David Thoreau. But the speech that attracted the most attention and left the most lasting impression was delivered by the great abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. Much of what Garrison said that day was familiar to all opponents of slavery. July 4th is, of course, the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and even the most mainstream of mainstream anti-slavery politicians would have nodded in agreement as Garrison insisted that the famous phrase, "all men are created equal," meant that every human being was equally entitled to the natural right of freedom, and that slavery was a violation of that sacred principle. When Garrison held up a copy of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and set it on fire, those same mainstream politicians might have winced, but they would not have disagreed with the sentiment. They all hated the law. Some wanted it revised, some thought it should be repealed outright, and some thought the fugitive slave law was unconstitutional. And that's where most anti-slavery folks parted company with Garrison. He didn't think the Fugitive Slave Act was unconstitutional. He thought the law was perfectly consistent with the Constitution. He felt the same way about the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed a few months before, which reopened the Nebraska Territory to slavery. And he felt the same way about the recent rendition of Anthony Burns, a fugitive slave who had been marched through the streets of Boston by federal troops returning him to slavery in the face of 50,000 protesters. Most of slavery's opponents thought the Kansas-Nebraska Act was inconsistent with the Constitution. Most believed that Anthony Burns had been deprived of his constitutional rights, but not William Lloyd Garrison. None of the recent victories of the so-called slave power, the Fugitive Slave Act, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the rendition of Anthony Burns, none of these were violations of the Constitution, Garrison insisted. If anything, they were caused by the Constitution. Quote, "The source and parent of all the other atrocities," Garrison declared that day, was the Constitution itself, which he then denounced as a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. Striking another match, Garrison held up a copy of the U.S. Constitution and set it on fire as well. 6 years later, in Glasgow, Scotland, another great abolitionist, Frederick Douglass, gave a very different speech. After escaping from slavery in 1838, Garrison moved to New England, where he joined the Garrisonian branch of the abolitionist movement and argued that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. But by the early 1850s, Douglass, having moved to Rochester, New York, and found himself among a very different group of abolitionists, announced a change of heart. Far from being a pro-slavery document, Douglass declared, the Constitution was in fact an anti-slavery document. Indeed, it was an abolitionist document. Along with most anti-slavery people, Douglass now held that both the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the 1850 Fugitive Slave Acts were unconstitutional. But he also believed that the Constitution gave the federal government the power to abolish slavery everywhere in the United States, not only in the territories, but in the slave states themselves, a position no anti-slavery politician took. It looked as though Douglass had leaped from one extreme to the other, from a constitution as a document that protected slavery always and everywhere, to a document that would abolish slavery always and everywhere. Like Frederick Douglass, I used to agree with Garrison. I once published an article in a law review denouncing the founders for their pusillanimous compromises with slavery at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. But then I began working on a book about the relationship between Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, neither of whom, it turned out, agreed with Garrison. Whatever else divided them, both agreed that the Constitution was fundamentally an anti-slavery document. And the more I looked into it, the clearer it became that hardly any anti-slavery folks agreed with Garrison, including the majority of abolitionists. And once I realized this, I started rethinking the whole issue of slavery and the Constitution. There were some basic questions I was going to have to ask myself, beginning with, what was this anti-slavery Constitution that nearly all opponents of slavery subscribed to? Were people like Abraham Lincoln deluded? Were they fooling themselves? Were they, as my friend Paul Finkelman would say, better lawyers than they were historians? By what he meant was that, as historians, we all know that Garrison was right, that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. Folks like Lincoln were good at conjuring up ingenious legal arguments against slavery, arguments that bore, alas, little relationship to actual historical reality, the reality being a pro-slavery Constitution. I now think that the anti-slavery constitutionalists were better historians than we give them credit for. And that's not because there were no pro-slavery clauses inserted into the Constitution in 1787. There were, but that's not all there were. Nor is there any question that the delegates at the Constitutional Convention reached a number of critical compromises with slavery, over slavery. But the word compromise implies back and forth, give and take, both sides making concessions to the other. The problem is that when scholars write about such things, they treat them not as compromises, but as abject capitulations to slavery. There were indeed pro-slavery and anti-slavery delegates at the Constitutional Convention. And yes, the anti-slavery delegates made concessions to the pro-slavery delegates. But, and this is critically important for understanding the Civil War, the pro-slavery delegates also made concessions to the anti-slavery delegates. For example, the pro-slavery delegates in Philadelphia wanted to count all the slaves in their states, 100% or 5/5 for purposes of representation. The anti-slavery delegates didn't want any slaves, 0/5 counted. Both sides compromised, and the result was the notorious 3/5 clause. Frederick Douglass came to view this as an anti-slavery victory because it gave the Southern states an incentive to increase their political power by abolishing slavery, at which point 5/5 of the freed people would then be counted for purposes of representation. My own feeling is that the 3/5 clause was an important pro-slavery concession because it enhanced the power of the slaveholders in both the House of Representatives and the Electoral College. But there were anti-slavery victories as well. The anti-slavery delegates proposed a clause that would allow Congress to halt the importation of slaves from Africa beginning in 1800. This would be the first such national law in the history of the world. The pro-slavery delegates initially threatened to walk out of the convention if any such clause was adopted. In the end, the pro-slavery delegates conceded the point in return for moving the proposed ban from 1800 to 1808. On balance, this was an anti-slavery clause because it resulted in the complete ban on U.S. participation in the Atlantic slave trade beginning in 1808, at the very moment the cotton boom was radically increasing the demand for slave labor. There were other implicit compromises. The Constitution authorized Congress to make all needful rules and regulations for the territories, and it was universally understood that this empowered Congress to ban slavery from the U.S. territories, as it did in Article 6 of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which organized this territory that we're standing on. But that same article contained the nation's first fugitive slave clause, which was then imported into the Constitution, thereby empowering the slaveholders to recapture their fugitive slaves who escaped into free territory. This was a quid pro quo. Congress assumed the power to ban slavery from the territories, and in return, the slaveholders got the right to recapture any fugitives who escaped into those territories. You can see this in the original wording of the Northwest Ordinance introduced by Nathan Dane of Massachusetts on July 12, 1787. Quote, "There shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory otherwise than in punishment of crime, comma, provided that always there any person escaping into the same from whom labor or service is lawfully claimed in any one of the original states, such fugitive may be lawfully reclaimed." As we will see, similar wording was incorporated into the Constitution as the Fugitive Slave Clause, thereby giving the slaveholders the right to the recovery of their escaped slaves. But what kind of right was it? Was it a common law right of recaption, as the Northerners claimed, or was it, as the Southerners would later claim, a constitutional right of property? The answer depends on whether the Constitution recognized slaves as persons or as property. We know that at the Constitutional Convention, the slaveholders tried several times to insert language that would recognize slaves as property, but they were repeatedly thwarted by anti-slavery delegates who objected to the idea that the Constitution should in any way recognize a right of property in man. As a result, the Constitution repeatedly refers to slaves as persons, never as property, even in the 3/5 and fugitive slave clauses. The founders are often criticized, with some justice, for their euphemistic evasions. They produced a constitution that refers to slavery in several places without ever using the word slave or slavery. On the other hand, the evidence we do have suggests that the delegates at the Constitutional Convention deliberately refused to recognize a constitutional right of property in man. That refusal might have threatened slavery in the southern states, for it would imply that the slaves were entitled to all the rights, privileges, and immunities the Constitution guarantees to all persons. It didn't imply that because of federalism. In this case, what historians call the federal consensus. This was the universally accepted principle that slavery was a state institution and that the federal government had no power to interfere with it, that is, abolish slavery in a state where it was legal. Thus, the potential threat of the Constitution's recognition of slaves as legal persons was neutralized by the federal principle that Congress could not interfere with slavery in states where slavery actually existed. So what should we make of all this? I'm a historian, not a constitutional lawyer. I recognize the power of textualism. The problem is that when it came to slavery, both its defenders and its critics were able to cite the text of the Constitution and claim that it supported their very different views. And while I agree that we should pay attention to the original meaning of the words of the Constitution, used in the Constitution, the federal consensus raises vexing problems because it isn't stated anywhere in the text. What was the original meaning of a constitutional principle, slavery is strictly a state institution, that just about everybody endorsed, but which doesn't appear anywhere in the Constitution? Moreover, although the federal consensus certainly had pro-slavery implications, it meant that the federal government could never abolish slavery in a state, it would eventually lead anti-slavery politicians to call for the complete divorce of the federal government from slavery. In this anti-slavery reading of the federal consensus, the federal government had no power to protect slavery anywhere. The simple fact is that the Constitution contained both pro-slavery and anti-slavery clauses and was based on principles that could be invoked by both the defenders and the opponents of slavery. As the years went by, both sides in the slavery debate cited those clauses and drew inferences from them to develop, over time, two very different legal traditions: pro-slavery constitutionalism and anti-slavery constitutionalism. It's easy to see how, for example, the power Congress had to regulate slavery in the territories gave rise to a number of questions that anti-slavery Northerners and pro-slavery Southerners answered very differently. Could Congress require Missouri Territory to abolish slavery as a condition for admission to the Union? Could Congress ban slavery from all the territory acquired from Mexico? Should Congress lift the ban on slavery in Nebraska Territory? These are the contentious questions that lead most historians to conclude that the conflict over slavery in the territories was one of the leading causes, if not the leading cause, of the Civil War. It is often said, for example, that the cause of the war was not slavery itself, but merely the expansion of slavery into the territories. I think this is a mistaken reading. I don't think most anti-slavery Northerners could separate opposition to slavery's territorial expansion from opposition to slavery itself. Consider the way anti-slavery constitutionalists framed the issue. By the 1850s, anti-slavery politicians representing a majority of Northerners certainly argued that Congress had the power to ban slavery from the territories, but they also argued that Congress could not constitutionally allow slavery in the territories. Why not? Because slavery, they said, was so odious a violation of natural rights that it could only exist where a positive law, basically statutes, actually created it. Such laws existed only in the slave states. The Constitution contained no such positive clause actually creating slavery. On the contrary, the Republican Party platform of 1860 put it this way. Freedom, it said, was the, quote, natural condition of the territories. The Constitution did not give Congress the power to override the natural condition of freedom in the territories. By contrast, the Constitution did oblige Congress to protect freedom in the territories. The federal government, it was said, can no more create a slave than a king. Hence, the anti-slavery position was that Congress could not only ban slavery from the territories, it was constitutionally obligated to protect the freedom of anyone in the territories that someone else was claiming as a slave. Viewed this way, the way Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party viewed it, the question of slavery's expansion could not be separated from the question of slavery itself. But of course, there were other ways to look at the issue of slavery in the territories. Pro-slavery constitutionalists, among them Jefferson Davis, saw the matter very differently. Congress, they insisted, had no power to ban slavery from the territories. On the contrary, the federal government was constitutionally obligated to protect slavery in the territories. That's because, in the pro-slavery interpretation, the Constitution did in fact recognize slave ownership as a right of property. Moreover, states decided what did or did not count as property, and Congress had no choice but to respect those decisions. Slaves then were legal property, and surely the federal government was obligated to protect the right of property anywhere it was sovereign. As John C. Calhoun put it, slavery follows the flag. On American vessels plying the high seas, on U.S. ships, even in foreign ports where slavery was illegal, and of course in the Western territories. But it wasn't only the states that defined slaves as property. As pro-slavery constitutionalists saw it, the Constitution itself created a right of property in man. Where did the Constitution do that? In the Fugitive Slave Clause, they said. This is why so much conflict over slavery depended on the question I mentioned earlier. What kind of right did the Fugitive Slave Clause give the slaveholders? Was it a broad constitutional right of property, as the pro-slavery constitutionalists argued, or a narrower common law right of recaption, as the anti-slavery constitutionalists argued? The answer to that question made a huge difference, legally, practically, and politically. If it was a property right, the government was obligated to enforce it. If it was a common law right of recaption, it was legally self-enforcing. What does that mean? What is a self-enforcing statute? Traditionally, in English common law, no government authorities were involved in a right of recaption. If you're recapturing property, let's say your cow wanders off into a neighbor's field, you have a common law right of recapture, the right to go get it. You don't need a sheriff, you don't need a court order. The same was true if you're recapturing a person. Say your wife abandons you or your servant or apprentice runs off. You have a right to go get that person, so long as there is no breach of peace, as it was called. The right of recapture was self-enforcing. This was how fugitive slaves were traditionally recovered before the Constitution. If the Fugitive Slave Law Clause of the Constitution gave slaveholders a right of recapture, it would mean that they were free to enter northern states and secure the return of fugitive slaves without the involvement of any government authorities, so long as they could do so without any breach of peace. Now, it should be obvious that there's a big difference between walking over to your neighbor's field and bringing home your stray cow and chasing down a fugitive slave, a slave who's gone to the trouble of crossing the Ohio River to get into Indiana, or has escaped the Mason-Dixon line over the Mason-Dixon line from Virginia into Pennsylvania. Such a person was unlikely to submit passively to the appearance of someone claiming to be their owner or their owner's representative. In such circumstances, there's very likely to be a breach of peace, and with that, the principle of self-enforcement goes out the window and the majestic power of the law sweeps in. Beginning in the 1780s, one northern state after another passed statutes to protect the due process rights of accused fugitives, often to protect free blacks from being kidnapped into slavery on the pretext that they were fugitives. Northern state law was based on the presumption of freedom, and that meant that blacks accused of being fugitive slaves were entitled to due process. They could sue their would-be captors on a writ of habeas corpus. They were entitled to a jury trial. Southerners were angered by such laws and demanded more and more protections of their supposed constitutional right of property to the recovery of their fugitive slaves. And as I noted earlier, they claimed that their slaves were legal property, that the Fugitive Slave Clause recognized their slaves as property, and that property is not entitled to due process. Northern states responded in turn. They required slave catchers to provide extensive documentation to prove that they were legally owned by the person in question and that the person in question was indeed the right person. The slaveholders, in turn, demanded that the federal government step in and enforce their rights against states that repeatedly interfered with them. The federal government did just that in the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, which squeaked through Congress despite the opposition of the overwhelming majority of Northerners in the House of Representatives. Sure enough, the Fugitive Slave Law provoked a furious backlash all across the North. Northern legislatures responded by depriving slave catchers of the use of local jails to temporarily house their captives. Some states made it a crime for local police or sheriffs to assist in any way in the capture of accused fugitives. The slaveholders could expect no help from state authorities. The Wisconsin legislature actually passed a law nullifying the federal statute. And that was just the legal reaction. There was also a massive extra-legal reaction. Federal commissioners who attempted to enforce the law were hounded out of town. Northern communities, especially black communities, banded together to thwart slave catchers, often at gunpoint. Meanwhile, local police often stood by and did nothing. The Northern prosecutors did manage to arrest those who interfered with fugitive slave renditions. Northern juries repeatedly refused to convict. All of this because the unambiguously pro-slavery Fugitive Slave Clause was in fact riddled with legal ambiguities, ambiguities that made conflict over the disposition of fugitive slaves the second major cause of the Civil War, alongside the dispute over slavery in the territories. Throughout the secession crisis, pro-slavery Southerners justified their withdrawal from the Union by claiming that the Northern states had rendered the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution null and void. And in one sense, they were right. Of the estimated 10,000 slaves who escaped to the North in the 1850s, only a few hundred were returned. The secessionists had a point. On the other hand, Northerners were right to complain that the slaveholders were claiming a constitutional right that the Constitution did not in fact recognize, that they were using the federal government to enforce a clause in the Constitution that conspicuously and deliberately lacked an enforcement clause, a clause that was supposed to be self-enforcing or, where there was a breach of peace, enforced by the states. It's worth pointing out here that when it came to the conflict over fugitive slaves, states' rights was the Northern position. The Constitution recognized slavery as something that existed only in states where it was legal, and yet here were slaveholders, slave catchers, coming into northern towns and cities, using the federal government, even the United States Army, to impose their slave system on unwilling and increasingly infuriated Northerners. By the 1850s, then, pro-slavery Southerners and anti-slavery Northerners had developed two profoundly different and fundamentally irreconcilable interpretations of the U.S. Constitution. And nowhere can we see this more clearly than in the infamous decision handed down by Chief Justice Roger Taney in 1857 in the Dred Scott case, and in the two dissenting opinions written by Justices Benjamin Curtis and John McLean. I'm not going to review the Dred Scott case here except to point out that although Taney's ruling is infamous for its pro-slavery extremism, few historians and still fewer non-historians have paid nearly enough attention to the Curtis and McLean dissents, which together summarized the basic principles of anti-slavery constitutionalism as they had evolved over more than half a century. Nor was Taney relying on the Constitution as it had been drafted in 1780s. Rather, he was invoking the pro-slavery Constitution of the 1850s. This is the critical context you need in order to understand what Taney was up to when he handed down his notorious decision in early 1857. It was a few months earlier, in November of 1856, the Republican Party candidate, John C. Fremont, had done surprisingly well in his campaign for the presidency. The platform on which Fremont ran repeatedly invoked the principles of anti-slavery constitutionalism. That's what Taney was trying to shut down, in effect, banning the Republican Party. Obviously, it didn't work. 4 years later, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln succeeded where Fremont had not. And whatever else there is to say about Lincoln, this much we can safely say. His politics were planted firmly within the anti-slavery constitutional tradition. The various anti-slavery policies he endorsed over the years were likewise grounded in anti-slavery constitutionalism. So, for example, contrary to pro-slavery theorists, Lincoln had long argued that Congress, quote, could constitutionally abolish slavery in Washington, D.C. Pro-slavery constitutionalists said it can't because slavery is a property, right? Property, and the Constitution doesn't allow Congress to take property away. Lincoln argued that Congress could and should ban slavery from the Western territories, indeed, that Congress had a constitutional duty to protect freedom in the territories. He argued that the Fugitive Slave Clause of 1850 should be revised to protect the due process rights of accused fugitives. And above all, he argued that the Constitution recognized slaves as persons, never as property. The platform on which Lincoln was elected in 1860 repeatedly quoted the Constitution, the preamble, which promised liberty to all, and the Fifth Amendment guarantee of due process rights, the Privileges and Immunities Clause, the principle of fundamental human equality announced in the Declaration of Independence was embodied in the Constitution, Republicans declared. Their platform likewise denied that there was a constitutional right of property in slaves. At the beginning of my talk, I mentioned that when Frederick Douglass changed his mind about the Constitution, he seemed to have jumped from one extreme to another, from Garrison's view of the Constitution as a pro-slavery document to the opposite view of the Constitution as an abolitionist document. But if you take the full measure of anti-slavery constitutionalism, I think there's another way to look at where Douglass ended up. His interpretation of the Constitution depended on the same clauses cited by anti-slavery constitutionalists across the North: the preamble, the Fifth Amendment, the Privileges and Immunities Clause, the Territorial Clause. It's just that Douglass drew inferences from those clauses that went one crucial step beyond anti-slavery politicians. He concluded that the Constitution was so thoroughly valorized freedom over slavery that it empowered Congress to abolish slavery in the southern states. For nearly all anti-slavery politicians, that was a step too far. But that should not blind us to the fact that Douglass's position, for all its radicalism, shared much more with Lincoln's anti-slavery constitutionalism than it did with Garrison's pro-slavery constitutionalism. They were closer than they seemed, and the proof is in the result. With those anti-slavery constitutional principles in mind, Lincoln and the Republicans took control of the executive and legislative branches of the government in early 1861 and proceeded to ban slavery from all the territories, abolish slavery in Washington, D.C., and suppress the illegal Atlantic slave trade. More consequentially, they nullified the fugitive slave law by refusing to return slaves who escaped to Union lines on the grounds that by seceding from the Union, the slave states had forfeited their constitutional right of recapture. And to top it off, they invoked the war powers of the Constitution to begin emancipating those escaped slaves. Congress never did abolish slavery in the state. It remained faithful to the federal consensus, and yet the end result of their crusade was the abolition of slavery in every state. Some years ago, when I started speaking and writing about anti-slavery constitutionalism, skeptics began responding by asking me a counterfactual question. Everything you say may be true, they declared, but would anti-slavery constitutionalism have led to abolition without a civil war? To which my answer is, without anti-slavery constitutionalism, there would not have been a civil war. If everybody in the North agreed with Tawney, or for that matter, William Lloyd Garrison, there would have been no reason for a civil war. If the pro-slavery Constitution was uniformly subscribed to as the law of the land, nobody in the North would have been calling for a ban on slavery in the territories. Nobody would have demanded due process rights for accused fugitive slaves. Nobody would have denied that that slaves were a constitutionally protected species of property. Nobody would have demanded that the federal government use all the constitutional power at its disposal to put slavery, in Lincoln's words, on a course of ultimate extinction. If the federal government had no power at its disposal to move against slavery, if the Constitution was simply a pro-slavery document, it's impossible to imagine a civil war. Okay, the skeptics might agree, but once the war started, how could anti-slavery constitutionalism possibly lead to abolition? And here my answer is similar. If anti-slavery constitutionalists did not believe that the seceded states automatically forfeited automatically forfeited the right to the return of their fugitive slaves, if they did not believe that the war powers entitled the commander-in-chief to emancipate slaves as a military necessity, there would have been no emancipation. If instead Lincoln and the Republicans agreed with Jefferson Davis that an Emancipation Proclamation was unconstitutional, then hundreds of thousands of slaves could not have been freed by the war, and there would have been no path, not even a crooked path, to the 13th Amendment. Here then is my reply to the skeptics. Anti-slavery constitutionalism caused the Civil War. Anti-slavery constitutionalism justified wartime emancipation, and wartime emancipation made the 13th Amendment possible. All of which leaves us to ponder one of the great paradoxes of American legal history. It took an anti-slavery constitution to get us an anti-slavery constitution. Thank you. Should I just take questions, or do you want to? We have time for questions, I'm told.
Do you know why Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves? I mean, the Constitution do you know why Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves? Do you know why?
Do I know why?
Yes.
Oh, there are many, 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 many answers to that question. He hated slavery. He said time and again, I have always hated slavery as much as any abolitionist. So you start with that. So when a series of contingencies happened during the war, his inclination was to respond by activating his anti-slavery convictions. Right? The war gave him the war. With secession, the slaveholders, forfeited their right to the return of their fugitive slaves, and the war powers he invoked gave him the right to emancipate them. So he had a legal right, and he was inclined to use that legal right because of his anti-slavery convictions. Right? So I would say that much as I admire Abraham Lincoln, I don't think it's quite correct to say that he freed the slaves, that Lincoln freed the slaves. Right? He justified the Emancipation Proclamation on the basis of the Confiscation Act that the Republican Congress had passed and sort of required a proclamation. So he does it because the Republican Party is committed to this and has passed these laws, a series of laws. So I hope that answers your question.
First of all, I really appreciated your lecture.
Thank you.
I think Lincoln would have had you in his cabinet. Just a lot of brilliant ideas.
Okay. All right.
I have 1,000 questions, but I'll limit it to 1.5. First of all, I want to know, have you read the book Forced into Glory by Dr. Lerone Bennett Jr.?
Yes, I did.
And what are your thoughts on that?
I think he doesn't understand anti-slavery politics. He was more concerned about Lincoln's racial views, which he interpreted as meaning he was not really anti-slavery. I think there's a distinction between Lincoln's racial views and his views on slavery. Mm-hmm. It's hard for us to imagine that you could separate the two since it was racial slavery. Sure. But I think it's safe to say that Lincoln, as I said, he always hated slavery, but he was not always committed to racial equality.
Correct.
He evolves on the question of racial equality. In the 1830s, when he was a young legislator in Illinois, he proposed a law that included, white suffrage and excluded blacks from voting. Right? He told racist jokes. He race baited his opponents, things like that in the 30s. He sort of calms down about that in the 1840s and stops doing that. When he becomes more involved in anti-slavery politics, which he really commits himself to in 1854, that kind of talk disappears from his language, right? And in the White House, he starts, the more committed he is to anti-slavery politics, mm-hmm. which he wasn't really, he was anti-slavery, but he wasn't an anti-slavery politician until the 1850s. The more committed he becomes to that, and the more radical that commitment becomes, which it becomes during the Civil War, the more he becomes committed to kind of racial equality. So that the very last speech he gives before he is assassinated, he becomes the first president in American history to openly advocate voting rights for blacks. Mm. No president had ever said such a thing publicly, but he publicly advocates it. John Wilkes Booth is in the audience listening, and he says, that means, pardon my language, that means nigger suffrage, and that means I'm going to assassinate him. Right.
I appreciate your response. My half question.
Sure.
You mentioned also the Dred Scott decision. You said that was in 1858?
1857.
57?
Yeah.
What was the finality of that? Wasn't it that no whites had to respect the rights of blacks? And was that ever overturned or overruled?
Oh, very good question. What Tony said is the precise language was that the founders believed that blacks had no rights a white man was bound to respect. Right? It's disgraceful. It's not even true. for the founders even. The position of the Republican Party is you have to respect the decision in the most narrow formal sense. Dred Scott and his wife and kids were sent back into slavery, much as they went. The rest of it was obiter dicta. We don't have to obey it, right? So, for example, Tawney says Congress had no power to abolish slavery in the territories. But as soon, and Lincoln says, if I was in Congress, I'd vote to abolish slavery in the territories. I wouldn't care what the Supreme Court says. We don't live in a world now where Congress would do such a thing. But back then, it wasn't yet fully established that what the Supreme Court says is absolutely the last word, the way we view it now. So Congress comes into power, abolishes slavery in Washington, D.C., bans slavery from the territories, does all these things that Tawney says the Congress can't do under the Constitution. So it had, the effect it had was sort of, it backfired. It made Northerners more angry already. You know, they were infuriated by the court's decision. And these two dissenting opinions I made reference to, the Republican Party printed thousands and thousands of copies of the dissenting position and handed them out all across the country to show what the Republican Party position was, which was the Constitution's interest. So it was important, but it didn't have much effect. So.
By Zoom?
Can I say, it didn't have the effect of making the government pro-slavery the way Tawney thought it would. It didn't abolish the Republican Party. It had a profound effect on the politics of slavery in the late 1850s. So.
Hello. There is one question in Zoom. This person wanted to start first by saying, Dr. Oakes, thank you for this very informative talk. You mentioned that extensive documentation was required by fugitive slave catchers in order to prove the enslaved individual was the person they were seeking.
Yes.
Where did you find those documents filed? Can those be found today?
You know where you see it? I found this out backwards. I wrote a big book. The biggest book I ever wrote was about the process by which slavery was abolished during the Civil War. And one of the things I discovered was that when Northern soldiers were down in the slave states and the slaves would run into Union lines and claim their masters were disloyal and therefore they're emancipated, the slaveholders would show up at Union camps and the Union officers would say, well, I need these documents. I need do you have a birth certificate? Do you have this? Do you have that? And very few people could provide the documentation. It was a tactic used to thwart the attempts by the slaveholders to capture their slaves. So this happened time and time again in northern states during the 1850s when the slaveholders, you know, they couldn't get most of their slaves because most of their slaves were being hidden, especially in black communities all across the North. They couldn't get at them. When they did get them, there wasn't supposed to be a trial. But lawyers would sweep down and force these rendition proceedings, and the lawyers, the anti-slavery lawyers would say, do you have documentation? Can you prove this? Is this the actual person? Can you prove that this is the person you claim it is? Can you prove that you're the slaveholder who owns this person? So requiring extensive documentation was clearly a tactic being used by anti-slavery folks to thwart renditions of fugitive slaves. It became clear during the Civil War. What I discovered that it had is that it had its origins in the fugitive slave debate debates of the previous years.
I very much appreciated your talk, and it got me thinking about, if I'm understanding you correctly, about how much of the origins of the Civil War were actually rooted in the compromises made at the Constitutional Convention.
Bingo.
And my curious question for you is, do you think the founders understood that these compromises were essentially kicking these issues down, kicking the can down the road, or did they really think that they were solving the problems by coming to these compromises, or what do you think was the actual final attitude?
I don't think you can say what the founders thought. I think the founders from South Carolina just thought slavery was going to go on forever. They were beginning to be aware that if they could just figure out a way to grow cotton, you know, it was just starting, and they knew because there were cotton factories had already been set up in England, and there was a demand for it, but they didn't have a cotton gin, and they didn't know how to do it, right? So, and that wasn't going to come till later. So they sort of saw the future of slavery. And up in the North, where they were all abolishing slavery, they just assumed it's going to go. It's destined to die. The forces of history are against it, and things like that. And so they viewed things like the ban on the slave trade as, step one in the ultimate, abolition of slavery. Virginians are a little tough because the tobacco economy was foundering, and they could imagine that it was going to die eventually. They didn't know how. They were worried that even if it does die, what are we going to do with all these black people? We don't really want them here, and things like that. So there is no, I can't say what the founders thought. They were kicking the can down the road. I think, you might be able to say that about some Virginians, but I think there were just too many different conflicting views about it.
Dr. Oakes, I really enjoyed your talk. Do you think, could you speak a little bit on Justice Taney's, do you think he was trying to avoid the Civil War by setting a precedent with what he was saying? Do you think he was just trying to shut down the anti-slavery constitutionalists, or was he just being an obstinate Southerner?
Or was he just being what?
An obstinate Southerner.
It could be both. I think he came out of a tradition and thought talking about politics, talking about slavery and national politics was just dangerous, and it should be shut down. Right? He came out of he was installed on the court by Andrew Jackson. He was part of Andrew Jackson's sort of kitchen cabinet, and Andrew Jackson's presidency represents a moment in American history when the two parties, the Whigs and the Democrats, were both explicitly committed to shutting down the kind of anti-slavery politics, or politics of slavery, that had threatened the Union in the Missouri crisis of 1820, right? So part of him is really, if we just shut up about this, it'll go away, right? Except that the shutting up was the shutting up for him of the anti-slavery position through the nationalization of the pro-slavery position. So.
Thank you for being here. I was wondering if anti-slavery politicians like Lincoln were consistent in their viewpoints on the legal status of slaves. Did they waffle back and forth between acknowledging personhood, or were they always committed to the idea of chattelized slaves as property?
Well, they're in an ambiguous position because, on the one hand, what it was to be a slave was to be property, right? That's, in some sense, the basic meaning of slaves, is that you are a chattelized human being. And so every anti-slavery person knew that slaves were property. So they all acknowledge that, and to deny that is, the question is whether the Constitution recognized property ownership in slaves as a constitutional right, and they're the anti-slavery people. So there's just an inevitable ambiguity in the way you hear them talk about it, right? There's no such thing as property in man in the Constitution. On the other hand, look, the slaves are property. Look, they're selling them and they're buying them and stuff like that. So I wouldn't call it an inconsistency. It's just an ambiguity built into the logic of their position, right? That doesn't mean that some of them weren't inconsistent. And some of it isn't so much inconsistency as evolution, right? The Northerners are becoming, and Southerners both, are becoming more and more and more radicalized in the positions they take leading up to the Civil War. And during the Civil War, the anti-slavery position is even more radicalized, right? Lincoln's position in 1861 is not as radical as it was going to be in 1864. Right, and he's evolving, and it's not just him, because I don't think he freed the slaves. I think Northerners are moving, the Republican Party is moving. Nobody imagined a 13th Amendment in 1860. Right? That's a product of what was happening during the war.
How would these constitutional decisions end up impacting, on both a legal and practical basis, U.S. interests and possessions in the Caribbean?
Oh, wow. The pro-slavery Southerners were anxious to get their hands on Cuba, right, and Central America, and because they wanted to increase the number of slave states, right? Because it was clear by 1850, it was clear by 1820, but it was certainly clear by 1850 that they had lost the House of Representatives because the North was growing so much faster. There were millions of immigrants and stuff like that. So the only way to maintain the balance of power correctly was to make sure that the number of slave states equaled the number of free states, and the best way to do that, one way to do that, is to grab Cuba, cut it up into 3 slave states or 4 slave states. The original Texas annexation document was imagined 4 states, out of Texas. So they're interested. So immediately upon taking office, Lincoln's Secretary of State, William Seward, proposes to the British that they invade Cuba to free all the slaves, to make sure that the South could never turn the island of Cuba into a number of slave states. So both sides have very different interests, and their interest in the Caribbean is determined, and their very different positions is determined by their anti-slavery positions at home. Does that make sense? Or were you asking for something different? That was later. They don't have Puerto Rico until the Spanish-American War, much later. Well, that was the big thing. The big one was Cuba, because Cuba had been an issue in the 1850s. The Southerners were proposing to buy it and threatening Spain to take it if you don't take our offer and things like that. So it was part of the conflict, was specifically about Cuba. And Cuba was by far the biggest slave island in the Caribbean. By then, the British, all the other, the French, the British, they had all abolished slavery on their islands. So Cuba was the island that was left. Cuba and Brazil, right, were the 2 big places. Is that it?
I'll give a big round of applause for Dr. Oaks.
Great questions. Thank you.
And Dr. Oaks, we have a token of our appreciation for you that I'd love to present. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight, and thank you to the Friends of the Lincoln Collection for your continued partnership with us at the library. And we have for Dr. Oaks this limited edition, lovely Lincoln Messenger bag that I hope that he thinks of us in Fort Wayne in the Rolland Lecture every time he uses it. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
And I can put my lecture in there.
Yeah, right.
Thank you so much.
Production facilities provided by Access Fort Wayne. Learn more under the Explore tab at acpl.info.